Chapter 15. Before I returned to the house, I wandered around outside the pasture fence, picking milkweed pods until my pockets bulged with them. "Where have you been, Annabelle?" my mother said when I came in through the mudroom door. "One girl gone is one too many. Do you know how worried I was when I found your bed empty?" I didn't want to lie to my mother, so I aimed for as much of the truth as I could. "You were in the cellar when I got up," I said. "The horses and cows needed to be put to pasture, so I did that, and then I figured I'd gather some milkweed for the troops. I pulled a soggy pod from my pocket, but I didn't have a bag with me." There wasn't much we children could do to assist the war effort, but we'd been asked to collect milkweed pods for their floss, which floated better than cork. The Navy needed it for life jackets, so all across the country, children had been out on milkweed detail. "I'll take the boys out and collect the rest before it's too late." Here was something a farmer dreaded: milkweed seeds wafting across orchards, setting down roots where they'd make a nuisance of themselves, driving the livestock mad if they rooted in pastures. My mother looked askance at me. "How come you're wearing so many clothes but no coat?" I shrugged. "I don't know," which oddly seemed to satisfy her. "Well, until everything's calmed down around here, you let me know before you go someplace. Where is everybody?" "Your brothers were up with the sun and pestered your father until he let them go on the search," she sighed. "I can just see it. Your father, 2 boys for dogs. Your poor grandfather driving the truck around in circles looking for some way to be useful." Which was fine with me, as long as they all stayed away from the barn. While my mother returned to her chores, I helped myself to some rolls from the bread box, filled a mug with coffee from a pot on the stove, and headed for the cellar. It was a big cellar with stone walls and floors and 4 rooms. One was for laundry, perpetually damp but clean, the wringer washer in one corner, lines strung from wall to wall, a wicker basket on a long table, and a cloth sack. In it, a cloth sack of wooden pins, tin buckets for hauling wash water from the well, a 1-burner stove for heating the water, and a drain in the floor. In another room, shelves lined with newspaper held jars of jam, pickles, peppers, beans, tomatoes, peaches, peas, and corn. The coal room had a chute set up close to the ceiling, so my father could shovel the coal in from the lane above. It was a filthy, sooty place where nobody went until winter came and the furnace wanted to be fed. The 4th room was for everything else that didn't belong above stairs: buckets that needed to be patched, empty canning jars, gardening tools, bulbs dug up and stored in bushels of peat. There was a door leading from the back of the cellar to the outside, lower on the hill than the rest of the house. Just outside was a separate entrance to the root cellar where we stored potatoes, onions, beets, carrots, anything that needed to last as long into the winter as possible. I took a tin bucket that was still sound but had seen better days and filled it with provisions: the rolls, a pot of strawberry jam, some carrots, a couple of empty mason jars and lids. I filled one with the mug of coffee. The others I would fill at the barn cistern. I left the bucket outside the cellar door and climbed the stairs. I found my mother stripping the sheets from my grandparents' bed while my grandmother sat in her rocker darning a sock. "I'm going back for some more milkweed," I said, and that's when I felt the first wave of sorrow that came from keeping a new secret. Perhaps by the end of this day, Betty would be found and Toby could return to his smokehouse, no harm done. If not, I would tell my mother. I could not keep this secret forever, nor could I hide Toby for long, cloistered in the hayloft like a stray cat. "Don't forget to take a bag this time," my mother said, as she stuffed the soiled linens in a pillowcase. "I won't." I watched the 2 of them at their work for another moment, so different, so much the same. The room filled with things they'd made, all of it worn to softness. The second wave of sorrow now was for Toby, too long deprived of such things if he'd ever had them at all. Without school, without brothers underfoot, I had plenty of time to myself. I would have spent much of it in the barn anyway, with a book and rock doves for company, but today was Toby's. "It's just me," I whispered, called at the foot of the ladder. No answer. I climbed carefully, the bucket heavy, the metal bale hurting my fingers a little. When I reached the top, I set the bucket aside and climbed near the ladder. "Toby?" He appeared then from behind a wall of bales. He'd taken off his coat. Without it, he was as thin as a spring bear. Hatless, he had no shadow in which to hide. His eyes were blue. "You made yourself a hideaway," I said. "That was smart." I gestured at the bucket. "Are you hungry?" He shrugged. "I have jerky. And now you had bread and jam, carrots and well water. Coffee, though it will be cold if you don't drink it now. I can bring you more after supper." Toby still hadn't stepped any closer to where I stood by the edge of the loft. A rail ran along there, but no spindles, next to nothing for a man afraid of heights. I'll bring more water too, but there's a cistern with a hand pump where we came into the barn. If you need to wash up after it gets dark, or you could go a little farther down the pasture. There's a trough. A spring feeds it so it's nice fresh water, cold though. I imagined that Toby normally bathed and washed his clothes in the creek that ran near his smokehouse, though his coat was so stiff with weather and soot that he never seemed particularly clean regardless. Now, as he stood there without it, he looked almost respectable. Though his hair and beard were long and tangled, but if you don't want to climb down. I moved the bucket well away from the edge of the loft, next to a bale Toby could use for a seat. He came closer, and I was reminded of the stray dogs when they first arrived at the farm. Nuts, I said. I forgot a knife for the jam. From his pocket, Toby pulled a jackknife. He sawed on a bell and cut a roll in half, twisted the band off the jam jar, pried off the lid, and with the tip of his knife, and spread some jam on half the roll. He held it out to me. Toby, that's for you. I can eat at the house. He held out the half until I took it. Toby spread his portion with jam and set it on his knee, while he wiped the knife clean between his fingers, closed it, put it away. He opened the jar of coffee. I'm sorry if it's cold, I said. He ate the roll thoughtfully, drinking from the jar. I took a bite, and only then realized how hungry I was. It seemed years since I had woken to find the constable at our table and the state police on their way. We ate in silence. Toby finished the coffee. Do you want me to bring you a book to read? I asked, fearing, as I said it, that he might not know how. Toby looked at me sharply. We have lots of books, all kinds. My brothers like Robert Louis Stevenson. I do too, I shrugged. If you want, I could bring you something, but you'll have to read it while there's daylight. Toby didn't need to think about it. Whatever you have, he said. I sat down on the floor and crossed my legs, tried to decide if it would be right to ask him some questions. I twirled a stem of hay between my palms. Can I ask you a question, Toby? He laced his fingers. You just did. I saw his mouth twitch again with the seed of a smile. I almost said, Can I ask you another question? But realized that would itself be another question. So I said, What's your name? Your family name. But Toby didn't answer. He looked away. No, I said quickly, I have a better one. I wanted to know where he was from, if he had any brothers or sisters, whether he'd ever had a dog and what he'd called it, and how old he'd been when he went to fight in the war, how he'd come to be hurt, how old he was now, though my mother always said he had to be 45 or so, and what he'd meant when he said he'd done something bad. What's your favorite food? I blurted, feeling like a child. This time, Toby looked straight at me, and after a brief pause said, Hickory nut pie. Really? My mother makes really good hickory nut pie. Did you know that? He nodded. She once saved me a piece. Best thing I ever ate. Toby's voice sounded different, softer. Said she was sorry it didn't have any cream on top. He shook his head. I don't know what I would have done if it had been any better than it was. Died, maybe. We spent some time like that, me asking small questions, Toby giving me longer and longer answers, until we were simply talking. Toby asking me questions too, so I told him about my grandmother, whom he had seldom seen, and about Aunt Lily, though all I said was, and then there's my Aunt Lily, who's a postmistress, at which Toby interjected a quick, yes, I've seen her, and nothing more. Until we got to the point when I had to ask him something harder, though I felt it was mine to ask. What did you mean when you told my father they'd made scratches on the turtle stone? Toby pulled back a little, tightening up to where he'd been, and spent a moment in thought. They were sharpening a wire. Betty and Andy? He nodded. Do you know what they did with it? He nodded again. If I'd seen them put it there, I would have taken it before it cut your brother. You heard about that? I saw you three coming out of Wolf Hollow, James bleeding, that girl, Betty, watching you cross the field. When you were gone, I went down the path and saw her unwinding the wire from one of the trees. She ran off when she saw me coming. The wire was gone when I took my father to show him. She took it with her. He looked straight at me. She was a bad girl. I didn't know what to think about the was. I stood up and dusted off my seat. I have to go gather up some milkweed, I said. Why? The Navy needs it for life jackets. Toby didn't say another word. I'll bring you a book later, I said, and left him to himself.